Something massive is unfolding with Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor in U.S., and the implications for global stability are difficult to overstate. The people making decisions about this right now are working with information that has not made it into public reporting yet, and the gap between what is happening behind closed doors and what is being presented to the public is significant. We are going to walk through the full geopolitical picture today, the key actors, the strategic interests, the historical context, and the most likely scenarios for how this plays out. This is the kind of analysis you need to navigate what is coming. Something fundamental is being left out of the public conversation about Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S. Not by accident, by design. The version of this story you have been given is incomplete in ways that matter enormously. And the moment you start filling in the gaps, the entire picture shifts. Over the next several minutes, we are going to walk through exactly what happened, who was involved, what the numbers actually show, and why the institutions that shape public opinion have had a very strong interest in keeping you focused on everything except the most important details. What you are about to hear is documented, sourced, and deliberately kept out of mainstream reach. The story of Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S. did not begin where the headlines say it did. The real starting point is years earlier, sometimes decades, in a series of quiet decisions that attracted almost no public attention at the time. That is not a coincidence. When powerful institutions make choices that will eventually become controversial, they prefer to make them incrementally, when scrutiny is lowest. What we are watching unfold right now is the visible surface of a structure that was built in the background for a very long time. Understanding who built it, why, and what they expected to gain is the only way to grasp why events are playing out exactly the way they are. The reason Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S. cannot be ignored is not the story itself, it is what the story reveals about the deeper systems underneath it. The timing is not accidental. This is happening at a moment when multiple pressure points are reaching critical thresholds simultaneously. The scale of the potential consequences is staggering in ways that most coverage is fundamentally unequipped to communicate, and the speed at which things could shift is faster than any official institution is currently preparing for. When you trace the connections between what is happening here and what is simultaneously unfolding in 3 or 4 other arenas, the picture demands serious and immediate attention. The figures surrounding Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S. are being selectively presented in a way that serves a very specific narrative. When you go directly to primary sources, the actual reports, raw data, statements made before they were filtered through communications teams, what you find is dramatically different from what the public has been given. The cherry picking is not subtle once you know to look for it. Entire data series are being truncated at convenient points. Percentages are presented without the base numbers that would change their meaning entirely, and the most significant findings are consistently buried in appendices that journalists rarely read and audiences almost never see. Every story about Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S. has a cast of visible players, the institutions, officials, corporations whose names appear in headlines. But the people who actually absorb the cost of what is happening here are almost never the ones being quoted. The second and third order impacts flow downward through systems that most commentators are not tracking at all. Workers, families, small communities, people operating in markets with no political representation and no media platform, these are the groups bearing the real weight. Understanding the gap between who is visible and who is actually affected is essential to grasping what is truly at stake. Beneath every public statement about Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S., beneath every policy announcement and every expert opinion that gets amplified in mainstream coverage, there is a financial structure that almost no one is discussing. Enormous sums of money are being positioned around this story in ways that make certain outcomes extremely profitable for certain parties and devastating for everyone else. When you trace the capital flows, the lobbying expenditures, the investment positions being quietly built up over the past 18 months, a very clear picture of who wants which outcome emerges. The records exist. They are public. They have simply not been assembled and presented in one place until now. The coverage of Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S. across mainstream outlets has been consistently wrong in ways that are not random. There is a recognizable pattern to the errors, and that pattern follows the financial and institutional interests of the organizations doing the reporting. Key facts have been underreported. context that would complicate the dominant narrative has been stripped out. Sources with credible, documented evidence that contradicts the official line have been ignored in favor of voices that reinforce it. When you compare the primary record to what actually ran in print and on broadcast, the divergences are significant enough to constitute systematic distortion rather than ordinary editorial imperfection. The analysts who study Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S. professionally, and who are not dependent on institutional approval to keep their careers intact, are reaching conclusions far more significant than anything you will hear on a cable news panel. The gap between what researchers publish in specialist literature and what gets transmitted to general audiences through mainstream media is one of the most consequential information failures of our era. We have been tracking expert consensus carefully, including voices being actively excluded from the dominant conversation, and what emerges is a picture simultaneously more complex and more urgent than the simplified version the public has been given. This is not the first time something like Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S. has played out at this scale. History is full of episodes that rhyme closely with what we are watching now, situations where the same combination of institutional failure, media distortion, concentrated financial interest, and public confusion produced outcomes that seemed unthinkable right up until the moment they occurred. Studying those precedents is not an academic exercise, it is a predictive tool. Human systems under similar pressures tend to produce similar failure modes, and understanding what went wrong in those historical episodes, what the warning signs were, where the inflection points were, gives us a real map for what comes next. Strip away the framing and spin from the public conversation about Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S., and what you are left with is a set of numbers that tell an unambiguous story, one being actively suppressed by the selective way statistics are being presented. Going through primary datasets systematically, including the sections never quoted in news coverage, the picture that emerges is starkly different from the one currently in circulation. The divergence between the full data and the curated subset reaching public audiences is not a matter of interpretation. It is measurable, and once you see the complete picture, the incompleteness of the standard narrative becomes impossible to unsee. Based on the current trajectory of Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S. and the historical patterns embedded in comparable situations, several distinct scenarios are plausible over the next 12 to 18 months. The most likely outcome is not the one being discussed in official circles. The conditions needed for the optimistic scenario to materialize are not currently in place, and the warning indicators that would signal movement toward the most damaging outcome are already present and strengthening. Understanding which scenario is most probable, and more importantly, what the early signals of a trajectory shift look like, is the most practically useful thing a serious observer of this story can develop right now. Everything we have covered about Trump draws parallel between Pearl Harbor and U.S. has direct practical implications depending on who you are and what your exposure to these dynamics looks like. The most important takeaway is not any single fact. It is the understanding that the version of this story available through standard channels is structurally incomplete in ways that carry real consequences for the decisions you make. The people already adjusting their positions in response to the full picture are not doing so because they have secret information. They are doing so because they have done the work of assembling publicly available evidence that most people never see put together in one place. That is exactly what we have tried to do for you today. If this analysis gave you clarity on a story that most coverage gets wrong, please hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are looking for serious analysis. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a breakdown. And drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read everything and your perspective adds real value to the conversation. See you in the next one.